So, good night. I am glad to see you all here this finally beautiful day for a talk about traditionalism. I'd like to welcome Professor Mark Sedgwick from the Aarhus University in Denmark, who is a historian, prominent knower of Sufism and also of traditionalism, about which he's written a book some 20 years ago, and now a new book is coming out in a month at the Oxford University Press.
For the United States
and Pelican Penguin for Europe. So if you are interested, there will be a more detailed account out very shortly. I am very glad to welcome you here on behalf also of our department. I'd like to thank the CREAS project for financing this event. In the last few years, we have been analyzing and exploring the subject of culture wars in Czech Republic, and we have come across many various types of attacks or criticisms of modernity, progress, and several political conceptions that are linked to modernity. And you could have noticed references that sound vaguely religious. They may all be subsumed under some type of reference to tradition, a word that is very difficult to, or a concept that's very difficult to define. Today's talk will look at tradition or traditionalism from a very specific perspective, bringing up a concept that seemed far away and maybe a little bit on the margins, but it's making a certain comeback in the last years in politics. So I'd like to invite Professor Sedgwick to introduce us to this concept, and we will be recording the lecture, but a part of the Q&A. So please take notes and remember your questions. There will be a lot of space to ask Professor Sedgwick questions afterwards.
Okay, so thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me here. Thanks to the faculty, to the university, to the European Commission, to everybody who's paid for this. And thank you for coming on such a beautiful afternoon as well. I am going to talk about a particular type of traditionalism, Guénonian traditionalism. And before I tell you a bit about Guénonian traditionalism, I want to say something about traditionalism in general, about other sorts of traditionalism. And then when I've talked about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current and recent political impact of Guénonian traditionalism. And then finally, I'm going to try and put these two bits together and explain why it is, or why it might be, that the philosophy of traditionalism has had and is having the impact that it is having. So, first, what sorts of traditionalism are there? And the answer here is that the word is sometimes used quite loosely, and sometimes it's used to denote a particular defined political movement. And when it's used loosely, sometimes it just means conservatism. And if you think, what does conservatism mean? Not changing stuff too much. And what does traditionalism mean? Not changing stuff too much. So in a very, very loose sense, it really means much the same as conservatism. Sometimes also when people are talking about traditions, they're talking about national traditions. So there's something which you could perhaps call national traditionalism. It's not national traditionalism, but it's building things around the idea of a national tradition, and that, therefore, is actually just another form of nationalism. But as well as these loose meanings, these loose senses of the term, there have been a number of movements which have used the term traditionalism in their name. And one of the earliest of these is what I am today going to call Bonaldian traditionalism, after Louis de Bonal, who I think is probably nowadays almost entirely unknown. But Louis de Bonal was one of the leading writers in an early French movement which used the term tradition and can therefore be described as traditionalist. And this was a movement just after the French Revolution, which was an anti-rationalist movement and which maintained quite a lot of things. But the central idea was that the idea that the revolutionaries had, that you could find truth through reason, was entirely wrong, and that the only way that you could find real truth was not through reason, but through revelation, divine revelation. So this is an anti-revolutionary movement after the revolution, connected with the Restoration, and in a sense could be called revelationism. The revelation in question, of course, being the Christian revelation. So they were therefore quite close to the Catholics, as was the case with many French counter-revolutionary movements. There's also Carlist traditionalism, which is found in Spain at about the same period and supports Don Carlos for the throne of Spain, and again is anti-liberal and pro-Catholic. Then we get actual Catholic traditionalism, which is the one that of these, I don't think people know much about Bonal or Carlist traditionalism nowadays, but the Catholic traditionalism, which is of course a reaction against the Second Vatican Council, that is reasonably well known, and it's still around, although it's probably less significant than it used to be. All these are in some ways connected with the Catholic Church, but the traditionalism that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, Guénonian traditionalism, is not at all connected with the Catholic Church. There was at the beginning, there was a slight crossover, but it's named after the French philosopher who founded this school of thought, René Guénon, who you can see here, hence Guénonian traditionalism. And René Guénon was born in Paris, died in Cairo, a Sufi and a Muslim. So those are the different sorts of traditionalism, and this Guénonian traditionalism is the one that I'm going to focus on this afternoon. Guénonian traditionalism is based around two big ideas. One of those ideas is that there is something that can be called the primordial tradition. Primordial in the sense that it has been there since the beginning of time, and tradition in that it is something which has been handed over. Because if you look at the etymology of the word tradition, or in French, tradition, it goes back to the Latin tradere, to hand over. So tradition, which is something which has been handed over or passed down. So Guénon has the idea that there is a primordial tradition which has been there since the very beginning, and which is the esoteric core of all exoteric religions. So if you think of if you think of things in terms of core and outside, all religions have this common core, which is primordial. The same for all religions, is esoteric and is the tradition. So the term traditionalism is really referring to this idea of the primordial tradition. So this idea of a primordial tradition is also known as perennialism, and it's an idea which has been around for quite a long time. You can trace its origins in the Renaissance, and there are also other perennialists. I don't know, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, which is expressing the same idea. So not all perennialists are traditionalists, but all traditionalists are perennialists. That's the first big idea. The second big idea is that you can place modernity and tradition in opposition to each other. That the chief characteristic of modernity is that it has lost the tradition. And since what is really important is the tradition, by definition, modernity and everything that comes with modernity is worthless or an illusion. So this second idea is an extremely fundamental critique of modernity and everything to do with it. So we've got these two big ideas, the idea of the primordial tradition and the idea of modernity as the absence of tradition, modernity as decline rather than progress. And these are the ideas on which the whole philosophy of traditionalism is built. The ideas have very varied origins. They include, not specifically Bonal, but the whole French anti-revolutionary tradition, which was so big a theme in French 19th century history, the fight between revolutionists, republicans, secularists on the one hand, and the opponents of all that on the other hand. And Guénon certainly fits into this tradition. But he also fits into the tradition of 19th century alternative religiosity. And up here we have, I didn't put her name, I'm afraid. Ah, okay. Fortunately, she's down here as well, and I did put her name. We have Helena Blavatsky, who is the founder of the Theosophical movement, a Russian who emigrated to the United States and founded one of the most important alternative religious movements of the 19th century, which was anti-Christian, anti-colonial, and perennialist. So this idea of a primordial tradition, which you can trace back to the Renaissance, you also find in this very large alternative religious movement of the 19th century. And if you look at theosophy, I think the importance of theosophy is very much underestimated, because if you look at the New Age and the countercultural religious ideas of the New Age, 3/4 of them you can find in Blavatsky as well. So Blavatsky is the origins of a lot of things. There are also a certain number of the ideas which are very important to Guénon are transmitted to him by a Swedish anarchist painter called Ivan Ageli, who we see here. And Ivan Ageli is getting quite a lot of his religious ideas from the Sufis, and especially from a certain expert in Ibn Arabi, the great Muslim mystic philosopher, called Abdurrahman al-Aish. So the origins of the Guénonian traditionalism are very, very varied and somewhat global. The ideas produced by Guénon are then developed into two different directions by a number of people, amongst whom the most important are those who we see on the screen here. The two directions that it's developed in a sense, depend on which of the two key ideas you're emphasizing. If you're emphasizing the idea of the primordial tradition, the esoteric primordial tradition, you are going to go in a mystical, spiritual direction. And this is the direction in which Guénon's thought is taken first by Frithjof Schuon, a Swiss Sufi, and then by Said Hussein Nasr here, who's still alive and the most important living representative of this stream of thought. Nasr is an Iranian American, also a Sufi, and is primarily, I mean, during the Iranian Revolution, there were some political things going on, but basically, he's a spiritual teacher and a philosopher with no major interest in politics. Now, in the other direction, not so much the emphasis on the primordial tradition, but the idea of modernity as the negation of tradition, the idea of the critique of modernity, the idea of modernity as fundamentally problematic and in need of being replaced by something else, is developed by the three men who we see in the top row here. The first of them, Julius Evola, is an Italian who has a career which is quite interesting and which is extremely political, and we'll actually come back to that in a second. So at this point, I'll simply say an Italian political activist. And then we have Alain de Benoit, who is still alive and is the key figure of a French intellectual movement called the New Right. And this is something which he and a few friends established in the late 1960s, early 1970s as a direct reaction to the New Left and to the ideas of things like the Frankfurt School, which are so important on the left today. So this is a direct and deliberate response to them. And then finally, the youngest person on this screen, we have Alexander Dugin, who you may have heard of, a Russian whose daughter was killed last year by the Ukrainians, who were probably trying to kill him because of the role that he has taken in promoting the Ukraine war and so forth. That's what he's become very famous for in the last year or two, but he has a long and more interesting career than that. So that's the origins and the development, and we now get on to the next question of the political impact of Guénonian traditionalism. But before we talk about that, I just want to make a couple of general comments about the relationship between ideology and politics. And the first thing that I would like to say is that when one looks at leading politicians, and here we have a collection of leading politicians from just over there last year, they are, I'm not sure I could identify all of these, but they are generally practical politicians. They are generally pragmatists. They are flexible. And I think if you are too ideologically pure, you are unlikely to get into a photograph like that one, because to be a successful politician, you have to be flexible. The second observation that I would make is that there are a couple of definitions which are extremely important for political philosophy. One of them is the idea that one can distinguish between parliamentary politics and extra-parliamentary politics. And parliamentary politics is good, and extra-parliamentary politics may well be bad. And the other one is that one can make a neat definition between mainstream ideology, which is good and connected with parliamentary politics, and extremist ideology, which is quite possibly bad. Now, as I say, these distinctions are very important in political philosophy. But if one looks at what happens in real life, it isn't always like this. And I strongly recommend an article published a few years ago by Elisabetta Cassino-Wolf on the Casa Pound in Italy. And what she is doing in this article is she is looking at Italian politics over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and how ideas and people shift between the extreme and the parliamentary, and how the distinction that one draws in theory, and one sees on this slide, really, in the case of this very detailed analysis of Italian politics, it doesn't work like that at all in reality. And I think that these are two general points about politics which are both quite important. And when we move on now to the case of traditionalist movements, we will, I think, see how the extreme and the mainstream, the parliamentary and the extra-parliamentary tend to get confused with each other. Now, occasionally we find traditionalist movements which are primarily traditionalist and primarily extra-parliamentary. And here we have the textbook example, which is a movement in Italy in the 1970s, which is very much inspired by the traditionalist political ideology developed by Julius Evola. And we have a movement called the Centro Studi Ordine Nuovo, the Study Center for the New Order, which is led by a man called Pino Rauti, who we see here, and they are involved both in studies and in practical political action. And their practical political action involves blowing things up and killing people. They are a right-wing terrorist movement. And they have a certain impact on Italian politics at that time. In the end, what the Italians are calling the years of lead, when they have both right-wing terrorists and left-wing terrorists and an awful lot going on at street level, fails to destabilize the Italian political system, and Italy remains a democracy as it is today. But this was a traditionalist, purely traditionalist, extra-parliamentary movement, which shows that it can happen, but it was some time ago and is not the real point. However, it's part of the picture, which is why I show it to you. If we move on to today, we have extra-parliamentary movements around Europe, of which one of the most interesting is the identitarian movement. And the identitarian movement in Austria, which is one of the strongest, is led by a man called Martin Sellner, who we see here, whose inspirations include Evola and Benoit. So this is something we'll see, that here, really, they're only reading Evola, but here they're reading Evola, they're reading Benoit, they're reading all sorts of things. But there is still a significant traditionalist element in the inspiration of this extra-parliamentary movement, which at present, as you can see, gets up to doing fun things with candles and producing nice photos and things like that. We also, let's be topical, have a movement in Ukraine called the Proměny Club, which is inspired by Evola and by a number of other people, including Ernst Junger. Ernst Junger, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a German who is writing in the aftermath of the First World War. He's writing, I think many people have heard of the book Alles Stille im Westen, the anti-war, the great anti-war book of the First World War. Well, Junger writes the great pro-war book of the First World War. And as you can see, if you read Cyrillic, it's been translated into Ukrainian, and this happy Ukrainian soldier standing by a Russian missile that didn't blow up is proudly showing off his copy of the Ukrainian translation of one of the books of Ernst Junger. So here we have three examples, two actually, one historical, two very contemporary, of political movements inspired in part or especially by Evola and his understandings of traditionalism. These, however, are all a tiny bit marginal. What is mainstream is, well, we'll start with a historical example, and this is the first part of Evola's career. I do not have a photograph of him and Mussolini together. There's a photograph of him and of somebody who might be him and Hitler together, but it's not totally sure that he actually is him. But anyhow, his most important encounter was not with Hitler, but with Mussolini. And Mussolini briefly became interested in Evola's views on race, which, when the Italians passed race laws, as the Germans kept telling them they had to, then Evola's ideas have a certain impact there. So here we have, circled in red, the flexible, practical politician, and circled in green, the traditionalist. And this is the pattern that we're going to find also in other places. Here we have some more famous people. Circled in red is a certain American who we may be seeing more of in the future. This remains to be seen. And circled in green is Steve Bannon, the guy who won the election for him, who played a very major role in getting the man elected in the first time, and who is inspired, amongst other things, by the traditionalists. You probably don't know the Brazilian political scene, but if you do, we have the same thing here. We have Bolsonaro circled in red, and we have a couple of traditionalists, influences, advisors, guys in the background. Well, one of them is actually initially the foreign minister, so he's playing a political role. But he didn't last very long as foreign minister, perhaps because he wasn't sufficiently pragmatic and flexible. But in the middle, we have a guy who ran an awful lot of podcasts, an intellectual and an online intellectual, and once again very much influenced by traditionalism. If we go to Hungary, we have a pragmatic politician and a traditionalist advisor. The pragmatic politician was so pragmatic that he finally sacked the traditionalist advisor, which improved his electoral performance enormously, but it's the same pattern. If we go to Jordan, we can find a pragmatic, practical king and a cousin of his, a prince, who is once again a traditionalist and therefore playing a role in the background in politics. If we go to the United Kingdom, we find a practical and pragmatic prime minister, and I'm not quite sure that one would say that the king is a sort of background advisor, but he's once again very much influenced by tradition. If we go, now these are all fairly well-known, high-profile cases. If we go to Germany, we can find an AFD MP and an advisor whose picture I have obscured slightly, because it was in a private conversation with this man that I discovered that he thought that really far too few people in the AFD were reading Evola and the other traditionalists. He was a great fan of them, but you know, there weren't that many. Fine. If we put this the other way around, we have a number of people in the AFD, including a full-time parliamentary advisor of an MP, who is reading these guys and is influenced by them. And this is a case that I discovered completely by chance. And if I hadn't had that conversation with this particular guy at this particular point, he would never have dreamed that there was an evolution influence in this guy's office in the Bundestag. And there must be many more cases like this that are not sufficiently high profile to have been noticed. Then there's the famous case of Dugin, who, if you read the press, is some press articles is the wiki is Putin's Rasputin, according to some headlines, which I think there's no evidence the two men have even met, let alone that Putin is doing what he's told by Dugin. But Dugin gets a lot of time on the press, and he used to have a department of his own at the university and so forth. So he's a man who has a certain influence. Okay. Here we have a global phenomenon. We've seen it in Russia, we've seen it in the Arab world, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in the USA, and what is going on? Well, I'm going to try and answer this question of what is going on in terms of demand and supply. What do voters want, and what is being offered to them? If we look at any European country, and I'm looking here at Denmark because that's where I'm living, here we find at the last election we had three nationalist brown parties, and as usual they collected around 25% of the vote. And most European countries nowadays have one or more nationalist party, and typically 20–25% of people are voting for those parties. And if you look at the platforms of these parties, what these politicians are saying, or what voters are voting for, what is it that these voters hate? They hate liberal elites in universities, in capital cities, listening to lectures. They hate multiculturalism, they are afraid of the great replacement, and also they hate wokeness. They hate the idea that there are how many genders? 66, 73? They maintain there are only two genders. Good, okay. So, what is it that they are really having a problem with? Well, one way of understanding this, one way, I'm not saying it's the only way, one way of understanding this is to think about it in terms of equality. Equality which is fundamental to modern Western liberal values, and the French Revolution for that matter. And I think that most European voters are more or less prepared to accept equality at a basic level when it comes to people like them. However, when it comes to the liberal elites, things get more problematic. Your average nationalist voter does not see himself as being the same as the liberal elites in the city, nor does he fully accept the fundamental liberal idea of the separation of church and state, because he suspects that the state, if not run by the church, which it clearly isn't any longer in Europe anywhere, if the state is run by a liberal ideology, with which he absolutely does not agree. And what is this liberal ideology? Well, it includes the idea that there is equality between different ethnicities. And it includes the idea that there is really no difference at all between men and women except that which is socially constructed. And these propositions, your typical or stereotypical nationalist voter does not accept. And traditionalism provides an alternative. When we come to the ideas of the liberal elites, traditionalism firstly insists that the spiritual, the traditional spiritual, should have a role over the state. That instead of this pretend separation of church and state, that sacred authority should have a role over secular power. And this idea is put together with an idea of hierarchy. And I don't know how many of you play chess, but the one at the top is a bishop. That is to say, spiritual authority, which in the Indian caste system is the Brahmin caste, is what should be at the top above everything else. And following that is the military power, the kshatriya in the Hindu system, or the aristocracy, the rulers, the state in the Western system. And under that comes the merchant class, and last of all comes the ordinary person. So traditionalism provides, instead of this idea of equality, traditionalism provides a response which is the idea of a natural or sacred hierarchy. So here we have an alternative to the idea of equality, and an alternative to the values of the liberal elite, which are values which are clearly rejected by a significant minority of voters. We also have a response to wokeness. Men and women are clearly and fundamentally different, and there is a natural hierarchy here as well. This leaves us with the problem of multiculturalism. And here, the traditionalists do not provide a clear answer. It depends who you ask. If you go back to Guénon and say, excuse me, you were saying that there is a primordial tradition which is esoteric and is the core of all religions. That's to say, it is the universal core of all religions. Then this is an acceptance of a certain sort of universalism. But if you go to Alain de Benoit and say, are all ethnicities the same? He will say, no, they are not. Each ethnicity is distinct and should be protected. And then if you go to the version of this espoused by the identitarian movement, for example, they will say, yes, indeed, each ethnicity is distinct and must be protected, and what we really need to focus on just at present is protecting the European ethnicity from Islam. So you can get different responses to this question out of the traditionalist philosophy, but one of the responses that you can get out of it, the idea of ethno-pluralism, provides in some people's views, a version, something which works a bit like racism, but is much more intellectually respectable. No, it's not about race, it's not about biology. Of course, we don't accept any of that stuff. It is about ethnicity and different ethnicities. So, what can we learn from the case of the intersection between Guénonian traditionalism and contemporary politics? One thing we can learn is that every age needs its symbols. And once upon a time, there was the symbol of Che Guevara, and of all those who thought Che Guevara was incredibly cool, not very many people actually knew what Che Guevara had been up to. Today, in certain rather more limited circles, it is Julius Evola who is incredibly cool. And once again, when one goes online to places like 4chan and sees the references to Evola, one wonders to what extent people have actually read him and to what extent they just are using him as a symbol. But in a sense, that doesn't really matter, because in politics, symbols can be incredibly powerful. There are other things going on in politics. And if I had to say what I thought was the single most important thing going on the right at present, I would say the Great Replacement theory. And here, I don't know if you were following the last French presidential election, but here we have a maverick journalist who, by talking about the Great Replacement, for a brief moment at least, comes remarkably close to winning the presidency of France. I should actually have a photograph of the Hungarian Prime Minister here, because he's also a fan of the Great Replacement theory. So there are other things going on, and probably the Great Replacement is the most important, and the Great Replacement theory, rather, is the most important, and that really has almost nothing to do with traditionalism. But traditionalism is still important. It still has a big influence in real politics, visible or invisible, marginal or central, and it plays a role in public debates. And why is this? Because I think it provides a response to many widespread concerns which express themselves in a refusal to accept certain equalities that the hated liberal elites think are fundamental. So that's my argument today. If anybody wants to read more, this is the book that I wrote about traditionalism some years ago, and this is the book that is coming out in 3 weeks' time on the new one, and is with Pelican, so that should be fairly easily available. So that is that, and if we have any questions.
So let's open the Q&A session and see if there are any immediate reactions or questions.
Or comments.
I was surprised to see King Charles there to open the...
You haven't been reading his books?
I have not.
No, I mean, his main interest is environmentalism. And his environmentalism is very much following the traditionalist model, following Nasser, the guy who was shown in one of the earlier slides there, who's one of the leading Muslim proponents of environmentalism.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful overview. Looking at these people, I mostly didn't read their writings, but I wonder how they capture the imagination of the masses, that they support them.
Yeah.
I would be curious about your assessment.
Yeah, very, very good, thank you. I should have made this clear. The masses do not read them, right? Guénon is incredibly hard to read. He has a difficult style, and he has the incredibly bad habit of saying, if you don't agree with me, then you haven't understood me, and if you haven't understood me, that's because you're just a modern person who doesn't understand tradition, which isn't a very good way to engage one's audience. So these guys, it is not a mass ideology at all. The way it has its impact is through politics. The way that it has its impact is through people like the anonymous AfD advisor whose own understandings are informed by this. Trump never read these guys. Bannon did.
So why the pragmatic politicians, if there is no demand from the masses, why they listen to their advice?
Okay, I mean the pragmatic politicians, I think, have to have two ears pointing in different directions. Pragmatic politicians have to listen to the masses and know what the masses are worried, or at least the section of the masses they're interested in, know what they're thinking and what worries them and what they want to hear. On the other hand, you can't just chase around after popular opinion in that fashion. You have to have, if you're a governing politician, you need advice and advisors, and whatever sort of politician you are, all politicians have advisors who are saying what they think, not saying what the public wants to hear. Does that make sense? Sort of.
Sort of.
But it's importantly, this is not a mass ideology, and it never will be. But it can inform people who are speaking to the masses, and does. Nobody else?
Hello, and thank you for the overview as well. I don't know if maybe it was debated with you this morning at the workshop. There is a big debate in the Czech Republic about the situation in Italy, what's happening with the new government and their prime minister, because there is a group of people which says that they are simply, or the prime minister is fascist, and then the people say, oh, but he supports Ukraine. If you can, what's your opinion about what's really happening with Italy, and what are how we could, pretty much that.
Yeah, fine. I have no idea whether the Italian Prime Minister has herself read Evola, but knowing Italian politics, there are people in her party, there are people in her movement, there are people in her office who have. So that would be, I mean, we'd need a few more faceless people there. But I mean, given the way that Italian parties have developed and ideas have been exchanged between them, and this article that I was recommending earlier, does this make her a fascist? Are any of these people fascists? Well, I mean, as we all know, to define fascist is extremely difficult, and there's really no consensus on this, and there are people who emphasize one aspect of the thing, people who emphasize another aspect of the thing. Dugin himself says he's not a fascist, and that if anybody wants to know his views on fascism, they can read what he's written about fascism. And Evola said he was not a fascist. He said he'd never been a member of the fascist party, and the fascist party had failed because it was too bourgeois and insufficiently extreme. So here are two people in the movement I've been talking about who are distancing themselves from fascism, either as being a failure, well, in both cases, as actually as something which has failed. I don't think that anybody today on the new right identifies with classic fascism any longer. I think that we have different ideologies. I think this is one of them. And I mean, if one had two baskets to put in leftist ideologies and rightist ideologies, and one had one basket which had Maoism sitting in it, and then one had historical fascism and these guys, they would have to go in the same basket if you only have two baskets. But I think they are separate things. The other thing I'd say is I think she's a practical politician. What people who voted for her thought they were going to get, and what they are getting, and what we will get, are different things. So I think that actually my first answer should have been she's a practical politician, not a pure ideologist.
If somebody calls them fascist or that she is fascist, that's a wrong framing, so how would you frame them?
We live in a post-fascist age. We live in a post-fascist age, and we also live in an age in which the old continuum of left and right doesn't work that well any longer. And I think if we're going to do a model like that, instead of left and right, we have to make it a triangle. And at the top of the triangle, we have to have nationalist. And I've tried to use this, and it works quite well, to identify politicians and parties' political positions. Because quite often the left is getting a bit nationalist, and the right is sometimes, in Denmark, for example, the mainstream right is less nationalist than the mainstream left. So, I mean, I think that this analysis of the triangle works rather better. And in the old days, fascism on the left-right axis, fascism would be far right. And on the left-right axis, we'd also have something which we could describe as far left. But I think the nature of politics has changed so much at present that one has to have a triangle rather than a continuum. By the way, I'm not saying that fascism is cool. I should stress that. This is analytical, purely analytical.
Yeah, thank you. Can you please a little bit elaborate more on this influence of Sufis to for example, conservative Christians? For example, which books they were influenced, these conservative Christians?
Sorry, if I understand correctly, about the Sufism,
influence of
with
Sufism,
Christians.
To for example, right-wing Christian conservatism. Thank you.
The first three traditionalist movements that I listed at the beginning all had relations with the Catholic Church. And there was a point, certainly during the 19th century, when the Catholic Church played an extremely important political role in opposition to liberalism. There is also, as we all know, a role which evangelical Christianity is playing in opposition to liberalism in the United States and in some South American countries, including Brazil. So Bolsonaro got lots of votes from the evangelicals. These guys, none of them are Christians. The religious ones that we are looking at here tend towards Sufism and thus towards Islam, which is slightly odd when you consider that other branches of the family are amongst Europe's leading Islamophobes. And when we consider that one of Trump's key ideas was the Muslim ban. So that's the religious orientation of the spiritual ones. And it's a consequence of their understanding of the primordial tradition and of modernity. Because in their understanding, since modernity is the absence of the primordial tradition, the Catholic Church has also lost the primordial tradition. The Catholic Church once, in their understanding, this is Guénon's analysis, the Catholic Church perhaps once had an esoteric content during the Middle Ages. Scholastic philosophy is perhaps a Catholic esotericism. But modern Catholicism is so modern that it has lost this primordial tradition, so we have to find it somewhere else. And we can go to Hinduism and we can read Vedanta, which Guénon did, or we can go to Islam and read Ibn Arabi, which Ageli did, and Guénon followed him in this. If we then turn to Evola knew about Guénon and Sufism, and he knew about Guénon and Hinduism, and he followed Guénon in reading some of the Hindus, and he was interested in Vedanta. He never really got into Sufism because it was just too different for him. However, he certainly did not get into Catholicism because Catholicism had no real content, no esoteric content, and also because he was following Nietzsche and Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, and he saw Christianity as a religion for slaves. And one of his criticisms of Mussolini was, in fact, the agreement that Mussolini made with the church. That was one of the problems with fascism, it failed to reject Catholicism. So where do we go instead? Where do we go to find the European tradition, the European primordial tradition, if we are interested in Europeans ethnically? We cannot go to Christianity because that has non-European origins. We might use the word Semitic. Some of them do, some of them don't. But we cannot go to Christianity. So where do we find the European myth? In paganism. Now, of course, to some European audiences, neo-pagan sounds really weird. If you are an Italian in the time of Mussolini, remembering the glories of the Roman Empire was, of course, in its heyday, pagan rather than Christian. But Evola, therefore, is a pagan, opposed to Christianity, or was, he's dead. Benoit is a pagan. All these people are pagans. I really don't know about Zellner. Bannon is a Catholic, he's an exception though. But generally, this particular traditionalism is not only not Catholic aligned, it's actually anti-Catholic and anti-Christian, which perhaps limits its appeal, but that doesn't matter because it was never meant to be a mass ideology, it's just meant to appeal to a few influential individuals here and there. I have a question at the back.
I'm just curious if you are studying traditionalism in context of contemporary Israel.
There were some Israeli traditionalists. There's this strange guy, Avigdor Eskin. They are all of Russian origin, Russian Jews. And Dugin, in an earlier moment, before the Ukraine war, Dugin was promoting a conception of what he called Eurasia, which is a civilizational and geographically defined area of which Russia is the natural leader. And this includes, of course, orthodoxy, but it also includes traditional versions of other religions. So it includes traditional Judaism, it includes traditional Islam, and Dugin was at one point a frequent visitor to both Turkey and Iran. So this is the civilizational unity, the traditional civilizational unity that he wants to put in opposition to the modern Atlantic civilizations led by the United States. So rather strangely, given Russia's history of anti-Semitism, especially on the right, there were Jewish members of the Eurasian movement and Jewish supporters of Dugin's traditionalist theories, some of whom emigrated to Israel and some of whom then established a sort of Israeli branch. As far as I know, it never went beyond Russian-speaking Israelis. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's right. I think this comparative view is very interesting, going globally around different cases, but we've been living for decades in an interconnected world. So I would be interested in a kind of transnational links between traditionalists and between especially the political impact of traditionalists. In theory, we would expect that traditionalists are kind of not very keen into cooperation among different traditions. But as far as I know, the identitarian movement, this is the case where these people tried to build kind of international network and also kind of corporate identity going beyond the particular nationalisms. Yeah. So this was, I think, interesting case. But there could be some other transnational links, and I wonder. I would like to hear you, listen to your opinion about how dangerous could these transnational links be, or if we just think that the traditionalism is, in fact, a kind of danger for democracy and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Taking those two questions in reverse. There is a tendency for people to, there's a tendency always for people to fight the last war, right? So if we're looking for dangers to democracy, it's got to be something like the Nazi Party, because that's what went wrong the last time. So there's a tendency to look for extremist, extra-parliamentary, anti-democratic organizations, especially ones run by a man with a moustache. I don't think that is where the danger to democracy lies nowadays. It's not in observably extremist, small observably extremist groups. It's in what's happening to politics as a whole. The problem isn't 6 weird guys dressing up in strange uniforms and giving each other salutes. The problem is that 25% of the population of Europe is currently voting in this direction that we have to call something, and which some of us call nationalist, and which I myself have been calling nationalist today. Now, that brings me to your first question. The apparent paradox of international nationalism. Now, the answer to that, I think, is that these nationalists aren't really nationalist. That they tend to talk about, starting with the identitarians, for example, they are not particularly interested in the current configuration of nation states. They are interested in civilizational blocks, ethnic blocks. So this is how the identitarians are a transnational, pan-European movement, because they identify with Europe as an ethnicity, not with individual nations. Now, as far as these others are concerned, I mean, the identitarians, are an extremely good example of the transnational movement. If you look at somebody like Dugin, who would be identified by many people as a Russian nationalist, he absolutely is not a Russian nationalist. He has always, throughout his career, his building blocks have been concepts. The initial building block was this concept of tradition and modernity, which he then mapped on to a geographical frame of Eurasian and Atlantic, but it's still the same basic idea of tradition and modernity. And I mean, what would a Russian nationalist be anyhow, given the multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of the Russian Federation? So he isn't a nationalist. And then, if we go up a level, as you say, we've been living in an interconnected world, and this is indeed a world where ideas travel and are then applied to local circumstances. So we have this process of globalization, where the local is the counterpart of the global. The ideas I've been talking about circulate transnationally, largely in English. Evola has been, I think, almost anything that Evola ever wrote has been translated into English in the period since 2000. And then is also translated into local languages. So, there are Serbian pirate editions of some of Evola's works and things like that. So the mechanism is the internet, of course, because you can sit anywhere on the planet and read Evola tonight, so long as you have an internet connection and read English. But this will then be applied to local circumstances, but it's local rather than national, I think. Long answer to a short question. We have another one there.
Yeah, one more. It's about links between traditionalism and capitalism or anti-capitalism.
Ah, yes. Good, okay. So, I mean, this is one of the respects in which the classic left-right continuum gets into difficulties, because the classic left-right continuum, the left was in favor of the state controlling or pre-opting private industry and directing it to the greater good of the greater number, and the right was about the market and capitalism. Now, even if we look at historical fascism and historical Nazism, their position on capitalism was not the diametric opposite of the communist position. I mean, the communists, of course, communists having portrayed capitalism as the enemy, and then having found Nazism or fascism as the enemy, needed to identify fascism and Nazism quite closely with capitalism, which they did. But neither of those movements, even historically, was in favor of an untrammeled free market capitalism. That was then. These guys today, none of them are in favor of untrammeled capitalism. A lot of them go for a sort of third way solution. So, everybody always likes a third way, don't they? During the Cold War, between the two extremes of American capitalism and Soviet communism, what do we have? We have traditionalism, says Evola, who, that's in his second period, in the period of the Ordine Nuovo. He's trying to position himself as a third way between the two. And Dugin's most recent major book is the one that he calls the fourth political theory. And fourth is actually third way, because he has three, he says we have three historical political theories, which in order of appearance were liberalism, communism, and fascism, and in order of disappearance were fascism, communism, and now we're just left with liberalism. But we need a third, we need an alternative, and this is a system that he then proposes based on his reading of tradition against modernity. So none of these guys are endorsing free market capitalism. And Benoit, the French New Right, its opening position was once again a third way. And their big think tank, which was called Grèce, which was the group for research on European civilization. So they were understanding European civilization once again as a third way between the two dehumanizing modern extremes of American capitalism and communism. Because capitalism is fundamentally modern. And in fact, if you look at definitions, almost anybody's definitions of modernity, the capitalism tends to get in to those definitions. So if you're anti-modern, you're necessarily anti-capitalist.
Is there some link between these traditionalists and the religious right?
Intellectually, no. Because the religious right is Christian, and the religious right may dislike some aspects of modernity, but they don't realize, the religious right does not realize that Christianity is extinct in all meaningful senses. So, religious right. In practice, however, the guys like Bolsonaro and Trump, who are associated with guys like Olavo de Carvalho and Steve Bannon, who are themselves inspired by this stuff, these politicians tend to take votes from the religious right, largely because the religious right doesn't realize quite who they're voting for. I mean, also, I mean, given Trump's rather strange track record on family values and relations with the female sex and so forth, you'd have thought that some of the things that we all know about Trump would have put off the religious right, but obviously they're more put off by the Democrats than they are by Trump's prior behavior. Is that sufficiently diplomatic? I mean, we're talking, okay, we're on the one hand, we have, if you remember my sort of list of the political applications of this, at the beginning I had some movements which were either purely or largely traditionalist. I had three movements of that sort. And they're completely distinct from anything on the religious right. They have absolutely no connection. They wouldn't begin to agree with each other for a second. And then the second group, where it gets much more complicated, where the central figure, the one with the red circle, is a pragmatic politician. And the pragmatic politician frequently courts the religious right. They want that the religious right is an important source of votes for them. So if I was doing one of those pictures again, we'd have the politician with his red circle, we'd have the religious right over there, him smiling at them, and whispering in his ear, we'd have the guy in the green circle, who certainly doesn't sympathize with the religious right at all, but understands the importance of that vote. So, I mean, if we're thinking about traditionalism and the religious right, if we go back to my first comparative traditionalisms, the loose sense of the word, where tradition means something like conservatism, I mean, there, yes, we can make an identification between the religious right and conservatism, because the religious right is opposed to certain changes that are happening or have changed and should not have, and so forth. So in that sense, you can identify the religious right with traditionalism as a very loose sense of the word, similar to conservatism. When one gets to specific movements and specific articulations of anti-modernism, then the 19th century movements I was referring to were connected to, you know, the 19th century version of the religious right was the Catholic Church. But today's ones, especially in Europe, no connection.
Let me follow up on that. You've said that traditionalism is presented as an alternative to equality, to the political equality, or something that appears in political discourses or in the political life. We have the neo-konzervative or radical religious right that is also this actually the most visible opponent to equality in terms of gender relations. Sometimes in certain countries, not everywhere, but in certain countries also in terms of ethnic relations, the religious right fights for traditional family and the Christian tradition of Poland, let's say, or Christian nationalism in the US. So they appear as the politically most important force against equality, but they do not deny equality as such. They do not stand against the idea of equality. They just usually bring in arguments that define rights in a different way. For example, but the traditionalism, if I understand well, would be the radical position that actually denies equality as something less valuable than hierarchy. It gives. Yeah. So what is the content of this opposition to equality? What hierarchy? What would be the positive aspect or the response to the rejection of equality among the traditionalists? And can we see some reverberations of these positions in the religious right?
I mean, first thing before I answer the question is that the conclusions of the religious right and the conclusions of my traditionalists sometimes look similar, but they're arrived at by very different routes, and sometimes they completely disagree. I mean, as far as the traditional family is concerned, for example, one of Evolar's best-known books, and I think one of his worst, actually, but it was one of his best-known books, is called The Metaphysics of Sex. And Evolar was very interested in sexual magic, had the theory that nobody was purely male or female, that everybody has a mixture of male and female in them. There's an elderly Italian priest who completely denies that he ever had a sexual relationship with Evola. In fact, he denies it so much that it's becoming more and more clear that this man, when he was a young man, was Evola's boyfriend. So, I mean, this doesn't fit with the traditional family at all. But anyhow, turning to the question about equality, the traditionalist position on this, found in Guénon, found in Evola, is that traditional society is hierarchical. If we look at Indian society, for example, we have the caste system. That men, by which I think he means men, not humanity, people, men, whatever, are different, have different abilities, different destinies, and are fundamentally unequal. And the natural traditional society is one where people fulfill their natural roles happily. The farmer as farmer, the scribe as scribe, etc., etc. Where does this idea of equality come from, then? Equality is a typical modern illusion. Equality is, in fact, the idea of equality is, in fact, a cover for making people more unequal than they need to be. The creation of the idea of individualism, which produces not actual individuals, but identical cogs in a mechanical machine, capitalist and industrial, who are kidded that they are somehow individuals in order to stop them realizing quite how much the system is turning them into little cogs rather than actual human beings. So equality is A, unnatural, B, untrue, C, an illusion, and D, modern industrial societies with their little cogs in their hives. Mass man living in a hive like a worker bee. There is no equality there. So there are various grounds on which traditionalism rejects the idea of equality. None of them have much to do with the religious right or religion in that sense.
Although we find the same argument in the Catholic activists.
I don't know. I'm not. I mean,
we actually find similar arguments that I think do not definitely don't refer to Guénon, but they absorb this idea that too much of inequality means isolation and atomization, and that actually a healthy society is a hierarchical society without saying the word. So in some ways, we could also look for parallels.
Certainly the idea of atomization versus hierarchical organicness is found in many places.
Okay, I have two questions, because a lot of questions here were around question of coherence. And maybe I will put it in more primitive way. How can Benoit accept Guénon? If we consider the fact that Benoit is pro-pagan, he is somehow defending nation states or civilization against migration, and Guénon actually accepted Islam and emigrated into Egypt. So it's my first question, and second question is, we see that it's quite a dynamic phenomenon.
Yeah.
For example, we have seen that Benoit accepted somehow the left. He had discussion with Michel. He even declared that he would vote centers against Trump, and so on. So what development can we expect from these streams?
Okay, the first part of this is that Benoit is not into the nation state, right? What he is defending against Islam, he's not going to put this quite as clearly as people like Guillaume Fay and other people close to him. Well, although they fell out over precisely this question, actually. If what needs defending is European civilization, and the bit of European civilization that needs defending is the traditional part of European civilization. And what does European civilization need defending against? At the beginning of Benoit's career, European civilization needed defending against the United States and its globalizing capitalist consumerism, which was the modern negation of tradition. So it's absolutely not the nation state. Now, what we in both cases then are valuing is traditional European civilization. Okay, take it the other way around. What we are opposing is Benoit, modern American consumerism, capitalism, Guénon, modern consumerism, society, equality, capitalism, oh, and by the way, America. So the enemies are the same in both cases. Where do we turn to get away from this? In Benoit's case, we turn to paganism as the repository of the European tradition. And in Guénon's case, we turn to mysticism, Sufism, as the repository of the human pre-modern tradition. So in a sense, they are actually quite close. The paradox, of course, is clear. And some people on the right say, you know, how can anybody defend Guénon who betrayed European civilization? And some people, some of the theorists, especially I think American theorists of the new right, do take this position. And Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer, in his extremely long manifesto, he dismisses all these traditionalists as people who have betrayed the European tradition by converting to Islam. So, you know, there are people who find these two points completely incompatible and therefore reject traditionalism. But there are other people, yeah, I mean, I think Evola himself, I mean, he said, yes, I understand that Guénon turned to Sufism. I am not going to do that myself. The differences of culture are too big for me to cope with. And by the way, I don't speak Arabic. So you can have this, but even though he absolutely was not going to go in that direction himself, he didn't have a problem with Guénon having gone in that direction because he understood what Guénon was looking for in it. Yes.
So do we have some more comments or questions?
I must say, by the way, you're a great audience. I haven't had so many such good questions on this topic for a long time, so thank you.
What I'd like to know is, how important is paganism to Benoit, really? I mean,
yeah, quite.
I believe that Dugin really cares about his idea of religion of some kind, but with Benoit, I don't know. He seems a lot more pragmatic than a lot of these other people.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, this is the answer is that's a really good question, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, I think you're right, and I think that, I mean, you know, Dugin is, I mean, his esotericism he finds in orthodoxy, and he claims that that's cool. You know, Guénon said that Catholicism had lost its esotericism, but, you know, he never outlawed orthodoxy, which is I mean, there's some truth in it, but it's not clearly obvious. But anyhow, Dugin just plugs into Russian Orthodoxy, and there's an awful lot of Russian Orthodoxy in Russia, and in order to have a more esoteric version, he plugs into the old believers, but you know, he plugs into an existing living community, which he can do. There is a shortage of a living, existing community of pagans in France. What one has is, you know, one has people who go and spend weekends in the woods. And I was listening to a paper about these guys who idealize the peasant lifestyle and take lots of canned food and audio tracks of Mozart, which, you know, isn't what real peasants had, as far as I know. So it's all a bit make-believe. But I think that what Benoit and friends would say in defense of this is that what they are looking for is the European tradition. And the European tradition takes various forms, and some of those forms include myth. And the point about myth is it doesn't have to be true. To ask whether myth is true or false is asking the wrong question. That is not the function of myth. And this is a line that's been taken by a number of other people, including Mircea Eliade, for example, who was very influenced by these people in his youth. So I think that Benoit finds paganism aesthetically appealing. He likes the myth. He thinks that the myth plays an important role in the creation of identity. But it's not a real thing in the way that Russian Orthodoxy is a real thing for the other people. So yeah, I mean, basically the proposition behind your question I'm agreeing with.
Do we have more comments or questions? If not, I retain the last slide of your presentation, the T-shirt argument. Because listening to all the questions, we can actually come up with a lot of people who do not necessarily have a lot in common. I was thinking the question on orthodoxy. Rod Dreja, who turns up a lot in Orban's reading room, who's friends of Bannon, but I don't know if he's a traditionalist, but we have a lot of people who actually combine some elements of all this discourse. They usually stand on the right wing. They are against equality. They are against modernity, but they compile their own anti-modern, anti-equality, and anti-immigration and position with where tradition is the word tradition is central. They don't necessarily go back to Guénon, but they often reflect some of these elements in this way in which the T-shirt reflects the face of Evola in the way in which tradition all of a sudden is cool or interesting because it brings us against this modernist pretension of realizing equality. So I feel that this is what I will be taking away also from your lecture. This creativity around the idea of tradition as opposed to modernity and as opposed to quality, in which a lot of very disparate positions can fall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tradition again. Only in traditionalism, you know, these guys they're reading traditionalists, they're reading Eveler, they're reading Jung, they're reading Nietzsche, they're reading Heidegger. You know, these so many different elements are being brought together, and I mean this is an element which I myself find interesting and generally underappreciated. I mean, everybody knows who Heidegger is, but not everybody knows who Eveler is. But for those who do know Eveler is, he has a certain importance.
So I guess we've made a tour of the comments. So thanks a lot for your lecture.
Thank you.
I'll just a technical remark. I'd like everyone, if you can sign the presence list, if you can, for our donor to make this, that made this possible. Sorry to.
Not get reimbursed for your
Yes, exactly.